Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. There's an old hotel perched on a cliff overlooking the sea, known to the locals as the Mariner's Rest. Once a grand establishment that hosted travelers from far and wide, it has since fallen into disrepair, its glory days reduced to whispers of the past. Still, the hotel remains open, offering rooms to those seeking a cheap stay near the coast. What most don't know is that something strange happens to its guests, something that defies explanation. It begins innocently enough. Travelers arrive, book a room, and are shown to their quarters by the receptionist, an elderly man named Edgar with an oddly vacant stare. The rooms are clean but dated, with creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper depicting nautical themes. At night, as the wind howls outside and the sea crashes against the rocks below, the guests drift off to sleep, unaware of what's to come. The first documented incident occurred in 1963. A young couple, James and Marianne Rivers, checked into room 12 after a long drive. Exhausted, they fell asleep immediately. But when Marianne woke in the middle of the night, something felt off. The air was colder, the walls were painted a different color, and the bed they were in wasn't the one they had fallen asleep in. Panicking, she shook James awake. They soon realized they were no longer in room 12. They were in room 34, a suite on the opposite end of the hotel that they hadn't even seen before. The door was locked, and despite their banging and shouting, no one responded. When morning came, they found the door mysteriously unlocked and hurried to the front desk to demand an explanation. Edgar, the receptionist, simply smiled and said, "Sometimes the hotel likes to play tricks on its guests." He offered no further clarification. Over the years, more guests reported similar experiences. Some woke up in rooms they hadn't booked. Others found themselves in parts of the hotel that didn't exist on the map. One guest even claimed to have awakened in a room with no windows, the walls lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. Word spread about the strange occurrences at the Mariner's Rest, attracting curiosity seekers, paranormal investigators, and skeptics alike. Despite the bizarre stories, the hotel continued to operate, its enigmatic nature drawing in more visitors than ever. In 1987, a team of paranormal investigators led by Dr. Alan Price arrived at the hotel, determined to uncover the truth. They brought with them an array of equipment, EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and audio recorders. The team booked multiple rooms and set up their devices, hoping to capture evidence of the hotel's alleged hauntings. On the first night, nothing unusual happened. The team recorded hours of footage and found no signs of paranormal activity. But on the second night, things took a sinister turn. Dr. Price awoke to find himself in a completely unfamiliar room. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air smelled of mildew. His team members were nowhere to be seen. When he tried to leave, he discovered that the hallway outside was vastly different from the one he had explored earlier. It was longer, darker, and seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. As he walked, the shadows along the walls seemed to move, flickering like candlelight. He heard whispers, faint at first but growing louder with every step. They seemed to be calling his name. Panicked, Dr. Price turned back, only to find that the door he had come through was gone. When the rest of his team found him the next morning, he was huddled in a corner of the hotel's basement, muttering incoherently about hallways that never end and voices in the dark. Digging into the hotel's history, a local journalist named Claire Whitaker uncovered a disturbing past. The Mariner's Rest had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy merchant named Gideon Thorne, who was obsessed with the occult. Rumors swirled that Thorne had conducted strange rituals in the hotel's basement, attempting to contact spirits from beyond. According to legend, one of Thorne's rituals went horribly wrong, opening a gateway to another dimension. While Thorne vanished shortly afterward, the hotel remained, and with it, the strange phenomena that began to plague its guests. Claire's investigation revealed that many of the rooms in the hotel didn't adhere to normal architectural design. Some corridors were longer than they should have been, while others led to dead ends or hidden doors. More chillingly, the blueprints of the hotel showed several rooms that didn't exist, or at least didn't exist in the physical world. By the early 2000s, the Mariner's Rest had become a place of legend. Those who dared to stay often brought along friends, hoping for a night of thrills and ghost stories. But not everyone who checked in left unscathed. One such group was a trio of friends, Nina, Tom, and Eric, who booked rooms for a weekend stay. On their second night, they woke up to find themselves in an entirely different part of the hotel, each in separate rooms. The doors wouldn't open, and the windows looked out onto a vast, starless void. The more they tried to reunite, the more disoriented they became, as if the layout of the hotel was shifting around them. Eric claimed he saw figures standing in the shadows watching him. Nina heard knocking on her door, but when she opened it, there was no one there. Tom found a mirror in his room that didn't reflect his image, but instead showed another room entirely, one where someone or something was standing silently in the corner. When morning came, they found themselves back in their original rooms, unharmed but deeply shaken. They left immediately, vowing never to return. Despite its reputation, the Mariner's Rest remains open. Edgar, now even older and more mysterious, still works at the front desk, greeting guests with the same vacant smile. Those brave enough to stay often do so for the thrill, hoping to experience one of the hotel's infamous room shifts. But many leave before dawn, too unnerved by the strange sounds and inexplicable occurrences. To this day, no one knows the true nature of the Mariner's Rest. Is it haunted by spirits from the past, or is it something far worse? Something beyond human comprehension? All that's certain is this: if you choose to stay, don't be surprised if you wake up somewhere you didn't intend to be. And whatever you do, never open a door unless you're sure what's on the other side. For at the Mariner's Rest, the line between reality and nightmare is perilously thin. Nestled in the heart of a forgotten valley lies Blackmore Cemetery, a sprawling burial ground surrounded by dense ancient woods. The cemetery dates back to the early 1700s when Blackmore was a bustling mining town. Over the centuries, the town dwindled into obscurity, and now little remains but crumbling ruins in this eerie cemetery. Locals rarely speak of Blackmore Cemetery, and those who do offer only cryptic warnings. Watch your step. Never tread upon the graves. For generations, stories have circulated about the cemetery. Whispers of a terrible curse that awakens the dead beneath the soil if anyone dares disturb their final resting place. While most dismiss the tales as mere folklore, others, especially those who live near the valley, swear by its truth. The origins of Blackmore Cemetery's curse are shrouded in mystery, but local legend points to a sinister event that took place in 1732. According to the tale, a witch named Margaret Halloway lived on the outskirts of Blackmore. She was known as a healer, offering remedies to the sick and injured. But when a plague swept through the town, killing dozens, Margaret was blamed. The townsfolk, desperate and fearful, accused her of witchcraft and condemned her to death. Margaret was dragged to the cemetery and buried alive in an unmarked grave. With her dying breath, she cursed the ground, vowing that those who disturbed the dead would join her in eternal unrest. Not long after her death, strange occurrences began. Graves disturbed in the night, shadows moving unnaturally, and, most disturbingly, sightings of the dead walking among the living. In the summer of 1985, a group of teenagers from the nearby town of Ravenwood decided to test the legend. The group, Mark, Lisa, Tom, and Rachel, had grown up hearing tales of Blackmore Cemetery. On a dare, they ventured into the cemetery one moonless night, armed with flashlights and bravado. Their plan was simple: walk through the cemetery, step on as many graves as they could, and prove the legend false. As they entered the cemetery, the air grew cold, and an unnatural silence fell over them. The flashlight beams flickered across rows of ancient tombstones, their inscriptions worn and faded. Despite the eerie atmosphere, the group laughed nervously and began their game, stepping boldly on the graves as they moved deeper into the cemetery. Nothing happened at first. Halfway through the cemetery, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He turned, shining his flashlight on the grave he had just stepped on. The earth seemed to ripple, as if something beneath it was moving. He called out to the others, but before he could finish his sentence, a skeletal hand burst through the soil, clawing at the air. Lisa screamed, and the group froze in terror as more graves began to stir. Dirt shifted, and decaying hands and arms began to emerge from the ground. The dead were rising. Panic set in, and they ran toward the entrance. But the cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Mark tripped over a tombstone, landing hard on another grave. Before he could get up, a ghastly figure, half rotted with hollow eyes, emerged from the ground, grabbing his leg. Tom and Rachel pulled Mark free, and the group sprinted toward what they hoped was the exit. The dead were slow, but they were relentless. More and more figures rose from the graves, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dark. Some reached out with bony hands while others dragged themselves across the ground, their skeletal faces twisted in silent rage. As they neared the edge of the cemetery, they spotted the wrought iron gate, partially rusted and ajar. With one final burst of energy, they dashed through the gate and collapsed on the grass beyond. Turning back, they saw the dead halt at the gate, as if an invisible barrier prevented them from leaving the cemetery. Breathing heavily, Lisa whispered, "Let's never come back here again." Word of the teenagers' experience spread quickly through Ravenwood. Though many dismissed their story as an elaborate prank, others believed them, especially the elders who had long warned of Blackmore Cemetery's curse. The mayor, fearing public panic, ordered the cemetery closed and the gates locked, though no one dared to patrol the grounds to ensure the order was followed. Despite the warning, thrill seekers and ghost hunters continued to visit Blackmore Cemetery over the years, hoping to witness the curse firsthand. Some returned with stories of strange sounds, moving shadows, and the feeling of being watched. Others never returned at all. In 2003, after a series of mysterious disappearances, the town council decided to take drastic action. They hired a team of archaeologists and paranormal experts to investigate the cemetery and, if possible, lift the curse. Led by Dr. Eleanor Graves, a renowned expert in folklore and curses, the team set up camp just outside the cemetery's gates. For weeks, they studied the graves, the soil, and the ancient texts found in the town's archives. Dr. Graves discovered references to Margaret Halloway and the ritual performed at her burial. She theorized that if they could find Margaret's unmarked grave and properly consecrate it, they might be able to break the curse. On a cold autumn night, the team conducted the ritual. Guided by Dr. Graves, they identified a sunken patch of earth near the center of the cemetery as Margaret's likely resting place. As they began to dig, the wind picked up, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the trees. The ground trembled, and the dead began to rise once more, drawn to the disturbance. Despite the terror around them, the team pressed on. Dr. Graves recited an ancient incantation as they unearthed Margaret's remains, a skeleton clutching a rusted pendant. With trembling hands, she poured consecrated oil over the bones and finished the ritual. The wailing ceased, and the dead froze in place before crumbling to dust. The air grew still, and an unnatural calm settled over the cemetery. The curse had been lifted. Today, Blackmore Cemetery remains abandoned, a relic of a dark past. Though the curse is believed to be broken, few dare to enter, and the gate remains chained shut. The story of Blackmore lives on in whispered tales, a reminder of the terrible power of disturbed souls and the danger of walking where the dead should rest in peace. And for those who do venture inside, one piece of advice remains constant: watch your step. Nestled in the heart of an old forgotten town stood the Blackstone Museum, a vast, imposing building made of dark stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. For over a century, the museum had been a place of fascination and fear. Its halls were filled with relics from distant lands, ancient weapons, statues of forgotten gods, strange masks, and scrolls written in languages no one could decipher. But those who worked there whispered about a darker truth. At night, the museum came alive. The museum had a long, troubling history. Its founder, Horace Blackstone, was an eccentric collector known for traveling the world in search of the rare and the cursed. He was said to have dabbled in the occult, often acquiring artifacts rumored to be imbued with dark magic. After his mysterious death in 1904, the museum passed through various hands, each owner reporting strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, eerie whispers in the dark, and a chilling sense of being watched. In 2023, a new curator, Eleanor Wells, was hired to manage the museum. Eleanor was a historian with a fascination for ancient civilizations. She had heard the stories about Blackstone Museum, but she dismissed them as nothing more than local folklore designed to attract tourists. Determined to modernize the museum and draw in more visitors, she began an extensive renovation project, cataloging every artifact and researching its origins. During her first few weeks, Eleanor noticed odd things. Lights flickered without reason. Exhibits that had been securely locked appeared slightly out of place in the morning. On several occasions, she found footprints in the dust, even though no one had entered the rooms overnight. One night, while working late, she heard a faint tapping sound coming from the Hall of Ancient Relics. Grabbing a flashlight, she cautiously made her way toward the sound. The hall was dimly lit, the shadows from the towering exhibits dancing eerily across the walls. As she moved closer to the center of the room, the tapping grew louder until it suddenly stopped. Her flashlight beam fell on an ancient suit of armor from the 15th century. The visor of the helmet was slightly ajar, as though someone or something had been watching her. Before she could react, the armor gave a loud creak, and the visor snapped shut on its own. Terrified, Eleanor backed away and left the museum, convincing herself that she was just tired and imagining things. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The following day, Eleanor shared her experience with Gerald, the museum's elderly night watchman. Gerald had worked at Blackstone Museum for over 30 years and was well-versed in its lore. With a grave expression, he warned Eleanor about the museum's dark secret. Blackstone didn't just collect artifacts, Gerald said. He collected curses. Every item here has a story, and most of those stories end in tragedy. At night, the spirits bound to these objects stir. If disturbed, they'll do more than just move. They'll seek vengeance. Skeptical but intrigued, Eleanor decided to investigate further. She pored over old journals, newspaper clippings, and letters from Horace Blackstone's era. One journal entry, dated October 13th, 1903, caught her attention. "I have acquired the final piece, a mask said to belong to the high priest of Zalakar. Legend has it that the priest bound his soul to the mask to escape death. If true, this will be my greatest triumph, or my doom." Eleanor discovered that the mask, an ornate golden artifact with strange symbols etched into its surface, had been placed in the museum's central exhibit. It was rumored to be the most dangerous item in the collection. That night, Eleanor decided to stay behind and observe the museum after hours. Armed with her flashlight, a notebook, and a sense of trepidation, she waited until midnight, the hour when, according to Gerald, the artifacts were most active. As the clock struck 12, the temperature in the museum dropped sharply. Eleanor's breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Suddenly, a low humming sound filled the halls as if the very walls were vibrating with energy. She could hear faint whispers, in languages she didn't understand, echoing through the corridors. In the Egyptian wing, a sarcophagus began to shake, and its lid slid open slightly, revealing the mummified remains inside. In the Hall of Weapons, swords rattled in their display cases, and an ancient spear fell to the ground with a loud clang. Eleanor felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her, watching, waiting. As she moved toward the central exhibit, she saw the golden mask of Zalakar glowing faintly. The symbols on its surface seemed to writhe and shift, forming patterns that hurt her eyes when she tried to focus on them. A deep, guttural voice echoed in her mind, whispering, "Free me." Suddenly, the suit of armor from the previous night stepped down from its pedestal. It turned its head toward Eleanor, the hollow visor glowing with an unnatural light. Before she could react, more figures began to stir. Statues, mannequins in period clothing, even skeletal remains in display cases. Eleanor turned and ran, the sound of clanking metal and shuffling footsteps growing louder behind her. She dashed through the dimly lit halls, knocking over display cases in her haste. As she neared the entrance, she saw Gerald standing by the door, holding a strange amulet. He raised it high and shouted an incantation in a language Eleanor didn't recognize. A blinding light filled the room, and the pursuing figures froze in place. The whispers ceased, and the museum grew silent once more. Breathing heavily, Eleanor turned to Gerald. What was that?" "The only thing keeping them from crossing into our world completely," he replied, lowering the amulet. "This museum is a prison for restless souls. As long as the artifacts remain, the curse lives on." Despite the danger, Eleanor couldn't bring herself to shut down the museum. She knew that doing so might release the spirits trapped within. Instead, she and Gerald devised a plan to keep the curse contained. They reinforced the displays with protective wards and secured the most dangerous artifacts in a hidden vault beneath the museum. Eleanor also documented everything she had learned, hoping that future curators would understand the risks and continue the work of keeping the curse in check. To this day, the Blackstone Museum remains open, drawing visitors from around the world. Most come for the history, unaware of the dark forces lurking within. But those who stay after hours speak of strange sounds, moving shadows, and the feeling of being watched. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the faint whisper of a voice calling from the central exhibit. Free me? There was a legend that haunted sailors and adventurers for centuries, whispered in the dim light of taverns and passed down from generation to generation. It spoke of an island shrouded in perpetual mist, lying far beyond the known seas. Some called it Spectre's Isle, others the Lost Haven, but to all it was known as the island no one returned from, a place ruled by spirits who tolerated no living soul on their sacred ground. For as long as anyone could remember, ships that veered off course or sought the island's riches vanished without a trace. No wreckage was ever found. No survivor ever returned to tell the tale. But that didn't stop the most daring and most foolish from trying. In the year 1824, Captain Elias Drayton, a seasoned mariner known for his fearlessness and thirst for adventure, became obsessed with finding the island. Rumors of vast treasures hidden by ancient civilizations fueled his ambition. Despite the warnings of old sailors, Elias gathered a crew and prepared his ship, the Sea Raven, for a perilous journey. Among the crew were seasoned seafarers, thrill seekers, and a few desperate souls hoping to find fortune. There was also Marian Thorne, a scholar with a deep interest in the supernatural. She carried with her ancient maps and journals, claiming they contained clues to the island's location. "We'll find it, Captain," Marian said confidently as they set sail. "But we must be prepared. The spirits of the island are said to guard it fiercely." Elias laughed, brushing off her warning. "Spirits or not, if there's treasure to be found, we'll claim it." After weeks at sea, strange things began to happen. The compass spun erratically, refusing to point north. The winds grew unnaturally cold, and at night, the crew heard whispers carried on the breeze. Marian urged caution, but Elias pressed on. One morning, as the mist thickened around them, the island came into view. Jagged cliffs rose from the sea, and dense, dark forests covered the interior. The air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness. As they drew closer, a sense of unease settled over the crew. "I don't like this," muttered Jacob, the ship's first mate. "It feels, wrong." But Elias was undeterred. He ordered the crew to drop anchor and prepare to go ashore. As soon as they set foot on the island, the atmosphere changed. The wind died completely, leaving an eerie silence. The dense forest seemed alive, the trees twisting in unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Marianne knelt by the shoreline, examining strange symbols carved into the rocks. "These markings, they're warnings," she said. "This island was never meant for the living." Ignoring her, Elias led the group deeper into the forest. They found remnants of ancient structures, crumbling stone pillars, half-buried statues, and what appeared to be a massive temple at the island's center. The air grew colder with each step, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of their vision. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the trees. Marian clutched her journal tightly. "The spirits are awake." As they approached the temple, ghostly figures began to appear, translucent forms that shimmered like the mist. They wore the garments of ancient seafarers and warriors, their faces etched with sorrow and rage. One by one, the crew members began to panic. Some tried to run, only to be swallowed by the mist, their screams fading into silence. "Hold your ground," Elias shouted, though even he was beginning to feel fear. The largest of the ghostly figures stepped forward. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and its voice echoed like thunder. "You have trespassed on sacred ground. None who come here may leave." Marian stepped forward, her hands trembling. "We mean no harm. We seek only knowledge." The spirit's gaze shifted to her. "Knowledge comes at a price. Leave now, or join those who came before you." Realizing they were outmatched, Elias gave the order to retreat. But as they turned back toward the shore, the island itself seemed to conspire against them. The forest grew denser. Paths that had been clear moments before were now blocked by tangled roots and thorny vines. Ghostly whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frenzied. Several crew members vanished into the mist, never to be seen again. Desperate, Elias and the remaining few fought their way back to the shoreline, where the sea raven lay anchored. As they reached the beach, the spirits closed in. Marion, clutching her journal, shouted an incantation she had found in the ancient texts. For a brief moment, the spirits recoiled, giving them just enough time to board the ship. "Set sail," Elias roared, and the crew scrambled to obey. As the sea raven sailed away from the island, the mist began to recede. The whispers faded and the air grew warmer. But when they looked back, the island was gone, as if it had never existed. Of the 30 crew members who had set out, only 7 returned. They spoke little of what they had seen, haunted by the memories of their lost comrades and the spirits that ruled the island. Marion's journal, filled with sketches and notes, was locked away, its contents too disturbing to share with the world. Elias never sought another treasure again, content to live out his days in quiet reflection. To this day, sailors still tell tales of Specter's Isle. Some say it appears only to those who seek it, a place where the living are not welcome. Others claim to have seen ghostly ships sailing near its shores, crewed by the souls of those who never returned. And on certain foggy nights, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of a mournful wail carried on the wind, the cry of the spirits who guard the island of no return. There was a place deep in the heart of the countryside that no one dared to enter after dark, a forest known as Eldergrove Woods. Unlike ordinary forests, Eldergrove had an eerie reputation. By day, it looked like any other woodland, with tall oaks, thick underbrush, and patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. But at night, it was said to come alive with whispered voices. These whispers didn't belong to the wind or animals, but seemed to echo the darkest secrets of those who wandered too close. Generations of villagers told stories about people who entered the forest only to return changed, or not return at all. Some claimed they had heard their own secrets whispered by the trees, secrets they had never shared with another soul. Others swore the forest knew things about them they hadn't yet done, as though it could peer into the future. Despite the warnings, there was always someone curious or foolish enough to venture in. One evening, a group of teenagers gathered near the edge of Eldergrove Woods. Among them was Lena, a fearless and headstrong girl with a reputation for taking risks. Her friends often teased her for her bravery, but on this particular night, their playful taunts pushed her too far. "Come on, Lena," said Jonas, her closest friend. "You're not scared of some old trees, are you?" "I'm not scared," Lena replied sharply. "It's just a bunch of silly stories." "Prove it," another friend, Sasha, chimed in. "Go into the forest and bring something back. Something from deep inside, not just the edge." Lena hesitated. She didn't believe in the stories, but something about the forest's dark outline under the moonlight made her uneasy. Still, she couldn't back down. "Fine, I'll go. But when I come back, you'd better admit I'm braver than all of you." Without waiting for a response, she turned and strode toward the forest. The moment Lena crossed the threshold into Eldergrove, the world seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the village faded behind her. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, only the sound of her own breathing. As she ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick that it blocked out the moonlight. She walked for what felt like hours, though her watch told her only 10 minutes had passed. Then she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. She froze, listening closely. The whisper grew louder, and soon it became clear that it wasn't just random noise. It was speaking her name. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "It's just my imagination," she muttered, but her voice sounded small and uncertain. As she took another step, the whisper changed, becoming a chorus of voices, each one overlapping the other. And then, to her horror, she heard a phrase that sent a chill down her spine. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had a secret, something she had never told anyone, not even Jonas. When she was younger, she had accidentally started a fire in an abandoned shed on the outskirts of the village. No one had been hurt, and the fire had been quickly extinguished, but the guilt had stayed with her ever since. How could the forest know? Panicking, Lena turned around and tried to retrace her steps, but the path she had taken was gone. The trees seemed to have shifted, forming a maze around her. The whispers grew louder, echoing her thoughts, her fears, her regrets. It was as though the forest could see into her soul, laying bare everything she had ever tried to hide. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled forward, desperate to find a way out. Suddenly, she tripped over something and fell hard onto the forest floor. When she looked up, she saw a tree unlike any of the others. Its bark was pale and smooth, and carved into its surface were words, her words. The tree bore sentences she had spoken throughout her life, from childhood to the present day. Some were innocent, but others were things she had said in anger or fear, things she wished she could take back. And at the very base of the tree was a new sentence, one she hadn't yet spoken but knew she would soon. As Lena stared in disbelief, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, hooded being whose face was hidden in darkness. The whispers ceased, replaced by a deep, resonant voice. "You have entered a place where truth lives," the figure said. "We know all that was, all that is, and all that will be. You cannot leave unless you make a trade." "What kind of trade?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "A secret for freedom. Tell us something no one else knows, and we will let you go." Lena hesitated. The forest already knew her deepest secret, so what more could she offer? Then she remembered something she had overheard her parents discussing in hushed tones late at night. They had planned to leave the village, fearing the curse of Elder Grove Woods. But they never did, and Lena had always wondered why. "My parents once planned to leave the village," she said quietly, "but they stayed because they were afraid the forest would follow them." The figure nodded slowly. "A worthy secret. You may go." As soon as the figure vanished, the trees parted, revealing a clear path back to the village. The whispers faded and the air grew warmer. Lena didn't hesitate. She ran as fast as she could, not stopping until she burst out of the forest and into the arms of her waiting friends. "Lena," Jonas exclaimed, "we thought you were lost." I'm fine," she panted, though she felt anything but fine. Lena never spoke of what had happened in the forest, but she knew one thing for certain. Elder Grove Woods was more than just a haunted place. It was a living entity that thrived on secrets, drawing in those who had something to hide. Years later, when Lena grew older and became the village elder, she warned others never to enter the forest, but there were always those who didn't listen. And so the legend of Elder Grove Woods lived on, a forest that whispered the secrets of the living, waiting for its next visitor, waiting to learn more. And if you ever find yourself near the edge of that forest on a quiet night, listen closely. You might hear it whispering your name, ready to reveal the secrets you thought were yours alone. High atop a jagged hill in the remote countryside stood Blackthorn Castle, a sprawling stone fortress shrouded in mist and mystery. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning travelers to steer clear. Unlike most abandoned castles that fell into ruin with time, Blackthorn appeared untouched by the centuries. Its massive towers loomed over the surrounding forest, and its windows glowed faintly at night, as though it were still inhabited. But no one lived there, or at least no one living. Legends claim that Blackthorn Castle was cursed, its halls haunted by countless spirits from across time. They whispered that the castle was not bound by ordinary rules of space or time. Within its walls, every door was said to lead to a different ghostly realm, each more terrifying than the last. Many had entered the castle seeking treasure or fame, but none had ever returned. One stormy evening, a young scholar named Edwin Marlowe arrived at the nearby village. Edwin had spent years studying the occult, and Blackthorn Castle had long fascinated him. He believed it held the key to understanding the boundary between life and death. Despite the villagers' warnings, he was determined to explore its haunted halls. "The castle is a labyrinth of doors," an old innkeeper told him gravely. "Each one opens to a different realm, and if you choose the wrong path, you may never find your way back." "I'll be careful," Edwin assured him. "I seek knowledge, not treasure." Armed with only a lantern, a journal, and a satchel of supplies, Edwin set off toward the castle, the storm raging around him. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he reached the massive iron gates. With a creak that echoed through the night, the gates swung open on their own, as if inviting him inside. Stepping into the castle, Edwin found himself in a grand hall lit by flickering torches. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries depicting scenes of war, death, and mourning. At the far end of the hall stood a massive door made of dark oak, its surface engraved with strange symbols. Edwin approached the door cautiously. As he reached out to touch it, the symbols glowed faintly, and the door creaked open, revealing a long corridor lined with countless other doors, each one unique in design. Some were tall and narrow, others wide and ornate, and some shimmered as though made of glass or liquid. "This must be the labyrinth the villagers spoke of," Edwin muttered to himself, pulling out his journal to record his findings. "If every door leads to a different realm, I must choose wisely." He approached the nearest door, a plain wooden one with a brass handle, and opened it. On the other side of the door was a desolate battlefield shrouded in fog. Broken weapons and skeletal remains littered the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. In the distance, ghostly soldiers marched in endless battle, their weapons clashing in eerie silence. Suddenly, one of the spirits turned toward Edwin, its hollow eyes glowing with a cold blue light. The ghost raised a spectral sword and began to advance. Edwin quickly stepped back through the door, slamming it shut. His heart pounded in his chest. "I see now. Each door truly leads to another world." Determined to continue, Edwin chose another door, this one carved with images of feasting nobles. Beyond it lay a grand dining hall, where a lavish banquet was laid out on a long table. Ghostly figures in fine attire sat at the table, laughing and toasting with goblets of wine. As Edwin stepped inside, the laughter stopped. The ghostly nobles turned to him, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles. One of them, a woman in a tattered ball gown, gestured for him to join them. "Come, traveler," she said in a voice that echoed unnaturally. "Feast with us and stay forever." Edwin felt a chill run down his spine. He backed away slowly, closing the door before the ghosts could rise from their seats. The next door Edwin opened revealed a vast library, its shelves stretching infinitely in all directions. The air smelled of old paper and ink, and the only sound was the soft rustling of unseen pages turning. He stepped inside, marveling at the sheer size of the place. "If knowledge is what I seek, perhaps this is where I'll find it." As he wandered through the aisles, he noticed that the books were not ordinary volumes. They seemed to be living records of people's lives, past and present. He pulled a random book from the shelf and opened it. To his astonishment, it was a detailed account of his own life, right down to the moment he had entered the castle. Before he could process this revelation, the shelves began to shift, closing in around him. The library seemed to sense his presence, and it didn't want him to leave. Panicking, Edwin ran back to the door and escaped just as the shelves closed behind him. Realizing the danger of staying too long in any one realm, Edwin pressed on. He opened door after door, each leading to a more bizarre and terrifying world. A frozen wasteland where time stood still, a burning city inhabited by shadowy figures, and a cavern filled with whispering echoes of forgotten souls. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached a massive iron door at the end of the corridor. Unlike the others, this door was locked. Carved into its surface were the same symbols he had seen at the entrance of the castle. "I need to understand these symbols," Edwin thought. He flipped through his journal, comparing the carvings to ancient texts he had studied. After a moment, he realized they formed a phrase in an old forgotten language. "Only those who seek truth may pass." Speaking the phrase aloud, he heard a loud click, and the door swung open. Beyond the door was a grand chamber illuminated by a pale blue light. At the center stood a throne, and seated upon it was a spectral figure, clad in silver armor. Its face was hidden beneath a helmet, but its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. "Who dares enter my domain?" the figure demanded, its voice echoing through the chamber. "I seek knowledge," Edwin said, standing his ground. "I wish to understand the mysteries of life and death." The spectral figure regarded him for a long moment. "Many have sought what you seek, but few have returned. Knowledge comes with a price." "I am willing to pay it," Edwin said. The figure raised a hand and a key appeared in the air. "Take this," It will unlock any door in the castle and lead you where you wish to go. But beware, once you leave, you may never return. Edwin took the key and turned to the nearest door. Using the key, he unlocked it and stepped through. To his relief, he found himself outside the castle, standing beneath the stormy sky once more. He looked back at Blackthorn Castle, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Though he had escaped, he knew he would never forget what he had seen or the secrets he had learned. Years later, Edwin published a book titled The Castle of Infinite Doors, detailing his experiences. Most dismissed it as fiction, but a few believed his story and sought out Blackthorn Castle themselves. None of them ever returned. And so the legend of Blackthorn Castle lived on, a place where every door leads to a ghostly realm, waiting for the next unwary traveler to enter. In a quiet, unremarkable town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a nursing home called Willow Rest Manor. To the townsfolk, it appeared like any other elderly care facility, peaceful and serene, with neatly trimmed gardens and large windows that let in plenty of sunlight. But for those who worked within its walls, Willow Rest Manor was home to a strange and unsettling secret. A cat named Osiris, who could predict death. Osiris was not an ordinary cat. He was sleek and black, with eyes as pale as moonlight and a presence that seemed almost otherworldly. He moved silently through the halls, slipping into rooms unnoticed, and wherever he stayed for too long, someone would inevitably pass away within a day. At first, the staff thought it was a coincidence. Cats are intuitive, they told themselves. Maybe he senses when someone is weak or near the end. But over time, the pattern became undeniable. Residents who showed no signs of imminent death would suddenly decline after a visit from Osiris. Some grew cold and fearful when he appeared, whispering that the cat was a harbinger of doom. One of the first to notice the cat's eerie ability was Nurse Clara, a kind-hearted woman who had worked at Willow Rest Manor for over a decade. She had seen many patients come and go, but nothing had prepared her for Osiris. "He knows," Clara would say to her colleagues. "He always knows when someone's about to go. But there's something more. It's not just intuition. It's like he's part of it, like he's waiting for something." Her fellow nurses dismissed her concerns. "You're overthinking it, Clara. It's just a cat being a cat." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was at play. One night during her shift, Clara was making her rounds when she noticed Osiris sitting outside a patient's room. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, unblinking and unnervingly focused on the door. The patient inside, Mr. Hargrove, was in relatively good health for his age. He had no serious ailments and had even spent the afternoon chatting happily with visitors. "Shoo, Osiris," Clara whispered, trying to coax the cat away. But Osiris didn't move. He simply stared at her, his gaze cold and knowing. Uneasy, Clara continued her rounds, but a nagging feeling made her return to Mr. Hargrove's room later that night. She found him lying motionless in bed, his eyes wide open in a frozen expression of fear. He was dead. Word spread quickly among the staff and residents. Osiris wasn't just predicting death, he seemed to be causing it. Fear grew within the nursing home, and whispers of the cat being cursed or demonic filled the air. Some staff members suggested getting rid of him, but strange accidents occurred whenever anyone tried. One worker determined to throw the cat out, slipped on a freshly mopped floor, and broke his leg. Another fell ill after merely threatening Osiris. The more Clara observed, the more convinced she became that Osiris was feeding on the souls of the dying. She noticed how, after each death, the cat would vanish for hours, only to return with an eerie calmness, as if sated by something unseen. Haunted by the deaths and her inability to stop them, Clara began researching folklore and ancient legends about death-predicting animals. One story caught her attention, a tale of a creature that appeared in times of death, not to mourn, but to consume. Such creatures, the legend claimed, were bound to places where death was frequent, feeding on the souls of those who passed. Determined to end Osiris's reign of terror, Clara devised a plan. She would trap the cat and take it far from Willow Rest Manor, releasing it deep in the woods where it could harm no one. One stormy night, she waited for Osiris to appear. When he finally did, she lured him into a crate with a piece of fish and locked the door tight. The cat didn't struggle. It simply sat there, watching her with those pale, gleaming eyes. "You won't hurt anyone else," Clara whispered, her hands trembling as she carried the crate outside into the pouring rain. Clara drove for miles deep into the forest where the trees grew thick and the air was heavy with mist. She stopped at a clearing, far from any road or path, and opened the crate. "Go," she said, her voice wavering. "You're not welcome at Willow Rest anymore." Osiris stepped out slowly, his fur gleaming in the dim light of the car's headlights. He turned to look at Clara one last time, his eyes filled with something that might have been disdain or perhaps amusement. Then he disappeared into the shadows. Clara drove back to the nursing home, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. She hoped she had done the right thing. For a time, things returned to normal at Willow Rest Manor. No more unexpected deaths occurred, and the atmosphere lightened. The staff began to believe that the curse had been lifted. But one night, a week after Osiris's disappearance, Clara awoke to a soft scratching at her door. Heart pounding, she opened it, and there, sitting on the doorstep, was Osiris. "No," she whispered, stepping back in horror. "You can't be here." The cat slipped inside, his eyes gleaming like twin moons. Clara realized then that Osiris was more than just a creature. He was something ancient, something that could not be escaped. The deaths resumed, but this time Osiris's presence was more elusive. He no longer lingered visibly outside rooms. Instead, the residents claimed to see his shadow flickering in the corners of their vision just before they passed. Clara, now burdened with the knowledge that she could never rid Willow Rest of the cat, began to write everything down: her observations, the legends she had read, and the strange, unexplainable events. Years later, after Clara herself had passed away, her journal was discovered by a new nurse. It detailed the haunting story of Osiris, the death-predicting cat who fed on the souls of the dying. Some say Osiris still roams the halls of Willow Rest Manor, silent and watchful, forever bound to the place where death is a constant visitor. And when the pale-eyed cat appears, it's only a matter of time before someone slips away, their soul consumed by the creature that cannot be stopped. Visitors to Willow Rest Manor occasionally spot a sleek black cat with eyes like the moon. They say it moves without sound, appearing and disappearing at will. Those who see it often feel an inexplicable chill, as if they brushed against something beyond the mortal realm. And though the staff tries to reassure them, everyone knows the truth. Once Osiris marks someone, it's only a matter of time. In a remote village surrounded by dark woods and misty hills, there was an ancient legend, one that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest inhabitants. The story spoke of a raven unlike any other, a great black bird with eyes as pale as winter's first frost, a creature that brought ghostly visions to those it visited. This raven, they said, carried the weight of forgotten souls, whispering their sorrowful tales to the living. At first, the villagers dismissed the tale as mere folklore, a story told to keep children from wandering into the woods. But those who had seen the raven swore by its existence. The bird would land silently near its chosen victim, fix them with its unnerving gaze, and leave behind visions of the past, memories that didn't belong to them, apparitions of the dead, and echoes of long-forgotten pain. One cold evening, as the village prepared for the coming winter, a young woman named Elena walked alone down the path leading from the forest. She was known for her curiosity, often venturing into places where others feared to tread. That night she had stayed out late gathering herbs and had lost track of time. As she hurried home, she heard the soft rustle of wings overhead. Looking up, she saw the raven perched on a twisted branch, its pale eyes gleaming in the dim moonlight. A chill ran down her spine as the bird watched her, unmoving and silent. Elena tried to ignore it, quickening her pace, but the raven took flight, following her at a distance. Every time she glanced back, it was there, its presence growing more oppressive with each step. Finally, she reached her cottage, bolted the door, and tried to shake off the unease. That night, as she lay in bed, the visions began. Elena found herself standing in a place she did not recognize. A crumbling stone house surrounded by mist. The air was thick with sorrow, and faint whispers echoed around her. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, and she felt an overwhelming sense of loss. A figure appeared before her, a woman in a tattered gown, her eyes hollow and her face streaked with tears. "Help me," the woman whispered. "He took us. We cannot rest." Elena awoke with a start, her heart pounding. She could still hear the whispers fading into the night. The raven was gone, but the vision lingered in her mind, vivid and haunting. Over the next few days, Elena tried to go about her life as usual, but the visions continued. Each night she found herself in a different place, witnessing fragments of lives that had long since ended. Sometimes it was a family fleeing from an unseen terror. Other times it was a lone figure wandering through endless darkness, calling out for someone who would never return. Word spread quickly through the village. Many feared Elena now, believing that she had been marked by the raven and cursed to see the dead. Some refused to speak to her, while others whispered prayers whenever she passed by. But there were a few who sought her out, hoping she could help them communicate with lost loved ones. One such person was old Merrick, a reclusive man who had lost his daughter many years ago. He approached Elena one evening, his eyes filled with desperation. "Please," he said, "if you truly see the spirits, ask them where my daughter is. I've never been able to find her." Despite her fear, Elena agreed, feeling a strange compulsion to help those haunted by unanswered questions. That night, as Elena lay in bed, she thought of Merrick's request. Soon, the familiar feeling of being pulled into another world overtook her, and she found herself standing in a dense forest. This time there was no mist, only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Ahead, she saw a young girl standing by a stream. Her clothes were torn, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Are you Merrick's daughter?" Elena asked softly. The girl nodded. "I got lost. I tried to find my way back, but I never did." Elena's heart ached for the child. "Your father is still searching for you. He's never stopped." "I can't leave," the girl whispered. "The raven won't let me. He holds us here." At that moment, the raven appeared, its wings spreading wide as it landed on a nearby branch. Its pale eyes locked onto Elena's, and for the first time, she understood the truth. The raven was not merely a bringer of visions. It was a guardian of lost souls, keeping them bound to the places where they had perished. Determined to free the souls trapped by the raven, Elena sought out the village's oldest resident, Grandmother Ivana, who was known for her knowledge of ancient lore. Ivana listened carefully to Elena's story, her expression grave. "There is only one way to break the raven's curse," Ivana said. "You must confront it directly and offer it something it cannot refuse. A soul willing to take the place of all the others." Elena was horrified. "You mean I have to give up my own soul?" Ivana nodded. "It is the only way. The raven is bound by ancient magic. It can only hold those who die in fear and regret. But a soul given freely, without fear, can end its power." That night, Elena returned to the forest where she had first seen the raven. She stood beneath the twisted branch where it had perched and waited. Soon the sound of wings filled the air, and the raven appeared, its pale eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I know what you are," Elena said, her voice steady. "I know why you hold these souls, but tonight it ends." The raven tilted its head as if considering her words. Then, without warning, it lunged toward her, its wings enveloping her in darkness. Elena felt herself falling, the world spinning around her, but she did not resist. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I offer myself freely. Let the others go." There was a blinding flash of light, and then silence. When Elena awoke, she was lying on the forest floor. The raven was gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. Around her, faint figures appeared, spirits of those who had been trapped for so long. They smiled at her, their expressions peaceful at last. "Thank you," they whispered before fading into the dawn. Elena returned to the village, forever changed by her experience. Though she had faced the raven and survived, she carried the memory of those lost souls with her. The villagers no longer feared her. Instead, they revered her as a protector, someone who had freed their loved ones from the grip of an ancient curse. And though the raven was gone, its legend lived on, a reminder of the power of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring bond between the living and the dead. In the heart of Black Hollow Woods, an old legend was whispered among locals. They spoke of a dog, large, black, and with eyes like burning embers that would appear to those who wandered too deep into the forest. Unlike ordinary dogs, this creature was said to guide lost travelers, beckoning them to follow. But those who did never returned. The stories varied. Some said the dog was the spirit of a long-dead hunter, cursed to roam the woods forever. Others believed it was a demon, luring souls to their doom. Yet despite the warnings, people occasionally ventured into Black Hollow, drawn by curiosity or the need for firewood and game. Those who went too far were rarely seen again. One evening, a young woman named Clara sat by the fire in her small cabin, staring at the empty chair across from her. Her younger brother, Ethan, had gone hunting 2 days before and hadn't returned. Though the villagers warned her to wait, Clara's worry grew with each passing hour. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Despite the legend of the Doomhound, she decided to search for Ethan. Armed with a lantern, a hunting knife, and a sturdy walking stick, Clara set out at dawn, following the familiar path her brother often took. The deeper Clara ventured into Black Hollow woods, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping birds faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pressed on, calling out Ethan's name. After hours of searching, she stumbled upon something strange, a set of paw prints too large to belong to any ordinary dog. The prints led deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the light barely pierced the canopy above. Just as she was deciding whether to follow the tracks, a rustling sound caught her attention. From the shadows emerged a large black dog, its fur sleek and glistening even in the dim light. Its eyes, glowing like twin coals, locked onto Clara. The dog didn't growl or show any signs of aggression. Instead, it stood still, as if waiting for her to follow. Clara hesitated, remembering the tales of the Doomhound. But she also knew that if Ethan was lost, he might have encountered the creature too. "I don't believe in curses," she muttered, trying to convince herself. Tightening her grip on the lantern, she took a step forward. The dog turned and began to walk, leading her deeper into the woods. For what felt like hours, Clara followed the dog. The forest grew darker, the air colder. Strange shadows flickered at the edge of her vision, and she began to feel as though unseen eyes were watching her every move. Finally, they emerged into a clearing surrounded by ancient trees. In the center stood an old stone well, covered in moss and ivy. Clara approached cautiously, her breath visible in the cold air. The dog stopped by the well and stared down into its depths. Clara peered over the edge, but she could see nothing below, only darkness. "Ethan," she called, her voice echoing into the void. For a moment there was silence. Then faintly she heard something, a whisper, distant but unmistakable. It sounded like her brother's voice calling her name. "Clara, help me." Without thinking, she leaned farther over the edge, desperate to see where the voice was coming from. But as she did, a cold wind swept through the clearing, and the dog let out a low, menacing growl. Clara stepped back, her mind racing. The whisper had sounded real, but something about it felt wrong. It was as if the voice wasn't Ethan's at all, but something mimicking him, trying to lure her into the well. As she backed away, the dog circled the well, its eyes never leaving her. Suddenly it barked, a deep, echoing sound that reverberated through the clearing. To Clara's astonishment, the ground near the well began to shift, revealing skeletal remains partially buried beneath the moss. She knelt to examine them, realizing with a sinking feeling that these were the remains of those who had followed the dog into the woods, drawn by its eerie guidance. The dog barked again, louder this time, and Clara understood. The stories were wrong. The dog wasn't leading people to their doom. It was warning them, keeping them away from something far worse lurking in the heart of Black Hollow woods. Gathering her courage, Clara turned away from the well. "If Ethan's here, I won't find him by falling into a trap," she said aloud, as much to herself as to the dog. The creature seemed to nod, then began walking toward another path. Clara followed the dog once more, this time feeling a strange sense of trust. They walked for several minutes until they reached another clearing. There, lying unconscious but unharmed, was Ethan. Clara rushed to his side, shaking him gently until he stirred. "Clara?" he murmured, blinking in confusion. "What happened?" You got lost, she said, relief flooding her voice. Come on, let's get out of here. As they made their way back toward the village, the dog followed at a distance, its glowing eyes watching over them. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the dog stopped. Clara turned to thank it, but before she could speak, it vanished into the shadows. Back in the village, Ethan recovered quickly, though he couldn't remember much of what had happened. Clara, however, knew the truth. The doom hound was not a harbinger of death. It was a guardian, protecting those who ventured too deep into the woods. Word of her encounter spread, and over time, the villagers' fear of the dog turned to respect. They no longer spoke of it as a creature of doom, but as a guardian spirit, watching over Black Hollow Woods. And though Clara never saw the dog again, she often felt its presence when she walked near the forest's edge, a silent protector in the shadows, ensuring that the lost could find their way home. Nestled deep in the vast prairie lands of the Old West, there was a small, isolated town called Black Ridge. Surrounded by rolling hills and endless fields, it had once been a bustling settlement for ranchers, cowboys, and travelers heading west. But in recent years, it had fallen into decline, haunted by a strange and terrifying legend, one whispered in hushed voices by the townsfolk after sundown. The legend spoke of a herd of ghostly horses that stampede across the prairie at midnight. No one knew exactly where they came from or where they were headed. All they knew was that anyone caught in the path of the spectral herd vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. Despite the stories, life went on in Blackridge. But when several ranchers began to disappear, leaving behind nothing but trampled earth and broken fences, fear gripped the town. One chilly autumn evening, a traveler named Elena Carrington rode into Blackridge. She was a skilled horsewoman with a reputation for solving mysteries that others feared to face. Word of the ghostly stampede had reached her in a neighboring town, and curiosity had driven her to investigate. Stopping at the local saloon, Elena was greeted with wary glances from the patrons. She could feel the tension in the air, as if the entire town was holding its breath. She approached the bar in order to drink, then turned to the nearest patron, an older man with a weathered face. "I hear you've got a problem with ghost horses," Elena said, her tone casual. The man's eyes widened in fear. "You shouldn't talk about them so openly," he whispered. "They don't take kindly to being noticed." "Who's they?" Elena asked. "The riders," another patron chimed in, his voice barely audible. "It's not just the horses. There are riders too. Ghostly cowboys who drive the herd at midnight." Intrigued, Elena pressed for more details. After some coaxing, the townsfolk reluctantly shared the full story. Decades ago, Blackridge had been home to a wealthy rancher named Jeremiah Kane, who owned the largest herd of wild mustangs in the region. Kane was known for his cruelty, both to his animals and his men. He worked his cowboys mercilessly and treated the horses even worse. One night, after a particularly brutal day, Kane's men mutinied. They set the horses free, intending to run them far away from Blackridge. But Kane, enraged by their betrayal, pursued them with a group of loyal riders. A fierce storm rolled in, and amidst the thunder and lightning, Kane and his men chased the mustangs to the edge of Deadman's Bluff, a steep cliff overlooking the river. The storm blinded them, and in the chaos, horses and riders alike plunged over the edge. None survived. Since that night, locals claim that Kane's ghostly herd returned every midnight, stampeding across the prairie, searching for something or someone. Determined to uncover the truth, Elena decided to stay the night at a ranch near Deadman's Bluff. The ranch belonged to Tom Hendricks, one of the few remaining cowboys brave enough to live so close to the cursed land. "That stampede's real, miss," Tom warned as he handed Elena a lantern. "If you're smart, you'll leave before midnight." "I'll take my chances," Elena said with a confident smile. "But I could use some company. Care to join me?" Tom hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you." As midnight approached, Elena and Tom waited on the porch of the ranch house. The night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass. Then, just as the clock struck 12, the ground began to tremble. In the distance, a low rumble grew louder, accompanied by the sound of pounding hooves. A ghostly mist rolled across the prairie, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Within the mist, shapes began to form. Wild horses, their translucent bodies shimmering like moonlit water. Behind them rode spectral cowboys, their hollow eyes glowing like embers. At the front of the herd was a towering figure on a massive black horse, Jeremiah Kane himself. Elena watched in awe and fear as the ghostly stampede thundered past the ranch. The horses didn't disturb the ground, nor did they leave any tracks behind. It was as if they existed in a world parallel to her own. As the last of the herd passed, Elena noticed something strange. One of the horses lagged behind, its spectral form flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, she grabbed her lantern and ran after it. "Wait!" Tom called, but Elena was already gone. Elena chased the ghostly horse across the prairie, her lantern casting long shadows on the ground. Finally, the horse stopped at the edge of Deadman's Bluff, the very place where Kane and his men had met their end. The horse turned to face her, and for a moment, Elena saw something in its eyes. A plea, a longing for release. Realizing what she had to do, Elena knelt and whispered a prayer for the lost souls. She placed the lantern on the ground and lit a bundle of sage, letting the smoke rise into the night sky. "Rest now," she whispered. "Your time here is done." As the smoke drifted upward, the ghostly horse began to fade. One by one, the other spirits appeared around Elena, their forms shimmering in the moonlight. Kane himself emerged last, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Then slowly, Kane removed his hat and bowed his head. The spectral herd began to dissolve, their forms blending into the night until nothing remained but the whisper of the wind. When Elena returned to the ranch, Tom was waiting, his face pale with worry. "What happened?" he asked. "It's over," Elena said, her voice calm but tired. "They won't be coming back." Word of Elena's deed spread quickly, and Blackridge began to recover. The fear that had gripped the town for so long faded, replaced by hope. As for Elena, she stayed in Blackridge for a while, helping the townsfolk rebuild. But when the next mystery called, she saddled her horse and rode off into the horizon, leaving behind a town forever changed by her courage. And though the ghostly stampede of Blackridge became nothing more than a story told to children, some still claimed to hear the distant rumble of hooves on quiet, moonlit nights. A reminder of the night when the past finally found peace.